A few years ago, geneticists did something no one had thought to do. They sequenced the families who actually settled the southern mountains, not the legend of those families, but the people themselves. And what the DNA returned did not match the story Appalachia had been told about itself for more than a century. For generations, the picture was fixed, a remote white enclave, pure pioneer stock. Fiddle music carried down intact from the hills of Scotland. The science contradicted that picture at its very foundation. It did not reveal a simpler people. It revealed a far more layered one, and it finally answered one of the region's oldest and most stubborn mysteries. The mountains had kept these people hidden. The genome kept the record. The Appalachians were never one people, and they were never who the legend claimed. The truth had been waiting there in the biology all along. For most of the last century, the story was simple, and the simplicity was the point. The people of the Appalachian Mountains were the descendants of Scots-Irish frontiersmen, tough, isolated, proud, pure pioneer stock, sealed off in the hollows for so long that they had preserved a way of life the rest of America had lost. Born fighting, the phrase went, white to the bone, a living museum of the old frontier with a fiddle in hand. That image did not come from the mountains, it was built for them. In the early 20th century, writers, missionaries, and reformers arrived in the Highlands and described what they wanted to find. They cast the mountain people as a frozen remnant, racially pure, ethnically Scottish, untouched by the modern world. It was a flattering portrait, and it was a useful one. Pioneer stock could be romanticized. It could also be studied, pitied, and managed. The legend served the people, telling it more than the people it described. And for a long time, almost no one checked. When historians and archaeologists finally did, the foundation began to crack. Audrey Horning, working the actual ground of the southern uplands, found something the legend could not absorb. The region had drawn settlers not only from the British borderlands, but from France, from the German Palatinate, from West Africa, and later from across Eastern and Southern Europe. Not a sealed enclave. A crossroads. Then came the genealogical record, and it was even harder to explain away. One researcher reviewed tens of thousands of documents, county by county, across the whole of southern Appalachia, searching for the homeland the legend insisted upon. The search failed. There was not one single county in which the Scots-Irish were the majority. Not one. Even the famous mountain feuds, the ones folklore blamed on hot Ulster blood, told a different story. French, Eversole, Tolliver, Sizemore, Mullins, Begley, name after name, and scarcely a son of Ulster among them. The numbers did not match the myth. They never had. The story of a pure, transplanted Highland people was not a description of Appalachia. It was a costume placed over it, and the moment anyone counted, the costume slipped. This matters because the myth was never harmless. It was used to romanticize the region and used to dismiss it, to call the mountain people noble pioneers in one breath and backward primitives in the next. Both judgments rested on the same false premise, that this was one people of one origin, frozen in one place. They were not. The records say so plainly, and the genetics, as we will see in the lines that follow, say so far more loudly than any document ever could. So if Appalachia was not built by the people the legend named, the obvious question is who built it instead. And the answer to that does not begin in the mountains at all. It begins an ocean away, on a windswept border soaked in centuries of raiding and blood. Start with the name itself, because the name is the first mistake. Scots-Irish. It conjures kilts and highlands, ancient clans, misted glens. Almost none of that is true. The people who carried that label were not Highlanders at all. They were lowland Scots and northern English borderers, and they had already been uprooted once before they ever saw America. Their story begins on the Anglo-Scottish border, the long contested seam between two kingdoms that spent centuries at war: Cumbria, Northumberland, the debatable lands. For generations, the people there lived under conditions that bred a particular kind of person. Raiding was a way of life. Cattle were stolen, houses were burned, blood feuds ran down the years, and loyalty extended to family and almost no one else. These were the reivers, hard, mobile, suspicious of authority, shaped by a frontier long before America had one. Then a king moved them. In the early 1600s, James I sought to subdue rebellious Ireland by seizing land in the north and settling it with loyal Protestants. The plantation of Ulster. Lowland Scots crossed the narrow channel by the tens of thousands and built new lives on ground taken from the Gaelic Irish. They were planted there as tenants and sharecroppers, never quite secure, never quite at home, surrounded by a population that had every reason to resent them. That is the truer meaning of Scots-Irish. Not a blend of two romantic bloodlines, but a people displaced twice. Border folk made into colonists, then made into emigrants when Ulster too failed to deliver the prosperity they had been promised. When they finally sailed for the colonies, they did not bring a Highland idol. They brought the hard instincts of the borderland, and those instincts found a familiar home in the rough country of the mountains. But even they were only one thread. The legend forgets the others entirely. Into the same foothills and eastern slopes came Germans from the Palatinate, fleeing war and want along the Rhine. Welsh families came, French Huguenots came, Protestants driven out of Catholic France. They cleared land, raised barns, and married into the population, and their names and their blood are written through the region just as deeply as any from Ulster. And many who came, of every origin, did not arrive free. They arrived bound. Indentured servants, men and women who had sold years of their lives to pay for passage across the ocean, working off the debt at the very bottom of colonial society. They labored beside one another with little to their names but the contract that held them and the hope of land when it expired. This is the world the legend erased. Not a Highland clan transplanted whole, but a mixed and bonded underclass, scraped together from across Europe. And at that very bottom rung, the indentured Europeans lived and worked beside another group the legend left out completely. The children born of those two worlds would become the most haunting mystery the mountains ever produced. They seemed to come from nowhere. Along the rugged border between Tennessee and Virginia, in the deepest folds of the mountains, lived a cluster of families that fit no category early America was willing to recognize. Roughly 40 of them, olive-skinned, brown-skinned, dark in a way that unsettled their neighbors. Not clearly white, not clearly black, not clearly native. Local stories insisted they had already been there, established and settled, when the first European newcomers arrived to claim the land around them. A name was fastened to them, and it was not meant kindly. Melungeon. For most of its life, the word was a slur, spoken about these families rather than by them, a way of marking them as something separate and suspect. And because they did not fit the rigid racial boxes of their time, those around them began to guess at where they had come from. The guesses grew wild. Perhaps they were the descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, washed up and wandered inland. Perhaps Turkish slaves, abandoned on the coast and pushed into the hills. Perhaps Romani travelers. Perhaps a lost Jewish lineage, or stranded Moors, or some vanished tribe that had survived in secret. Each theory was more exotic than the last, and each one traveled far. It is worth asking why such stories were not only believed but preferred. The answer is unknowable. In a society organized around a single rigid line between white and black, with rights and freedom and safety all hanging on which side you fell, almost any origin was safer than the obvious one. A romantic Portuguese ancestor was a story you could live with. It could keep your land, your standing, your children's future. The truth could take all of it away. So the families had every reason to reach for the exotic, and their neighbors had every reason to let them. But the real engine behind the Melungeons was not mystery. it was law. Through the 1600s and the 1700s, Virginia and the Carolinas passed an ever-tightening web of racial statutes, laws that policed marriage, defined status by the smallest fraction of ancestry, and steadily stripped rights from anyone deemed not fully white. For families of mixed origin, free but suspect, the colonies were becoming a trap that closed a little further every year, so they went where the law could not easily follow. They moved west and up, into the isolating folds of the mountains, into the hollows and ridges where records were thin and questions were few. The same isolation the legend would later mistake for purity was, in truth, a refuge, a place to disappear into, and to begin again as something else. For 2 centuries, the families guarded the answer, and the country around them kept on guessing. The exotic theories hardened into a kind of comfortable folklore. And then the science arrived, patient and indifferent to wishful thinking, and what it returned was quieter and far more devastating than any legend the mountains had ever produced. In 2012, a researcher named Roberta Estes and her colleagues did what a century of speculation never could. They tested the families directly. Working from documented Melungeon lines, tracing real lineages through real records, they conducted the first rigorous DNA study of the people behind the legend, and they published it in the peer-reviewed Journal of Genetic Genealogy. The folklore had had 200 years. The science needed only the genome. The finding, stated plainly, was this. The families historically called Melungeon descended overwhelmingly from sub-Saharan African men and white women of Northern or Central European origin. That was the core of it, not a riddle, not a lost civilization, a union of African and European, written into the chromosomes and impossible to argue away. And notice what was missing. There was almost no Portuguese signal, no Turkish lineage waiting in the data to vindicate the old stories, and little to no Native American ancestry in the core lines, which was, for many descendants, the hardest part of all. The native grandmother had been an article of faith, repeated across generations, and the DNA simply did not find her where she was supposed to be. So where did these families actually begin? The genetics pointed back to colonial Virginia, to the unions of black and white indentured servants laboring side by side at the bottom of the colonial order, before the racial lines had fully hardened. Their descendants were free people of color, born into a country that was busy making such people illegal. And as the laws closed in, they did the only thing they could. They moved west, into the mountains, where no one knew them, and over the generations they became, on paper and in memory, simply white. A word of honesty is owed here, in the way the evidence demands. DNA records outcomes, not intentions. It can tell us with certainty that an African man and a European woman had a child whose line endured. It cannot tell us whether that union was love or convenience or coercion or something with no clean name at all. The biology marks that it happened. The why is lost to the same silence that swallowed everything else. The study landed hard, and not everyone welcomed it. Some descendants rejected the findings outright, and the reason is human and understandable. They had been handed a romantic mystery, a flattering puzzle with a faraway answer, and the science traded it for something far closer to home. It replaced the exotic with the actual. It told them that their origins were not a shipwreck off some distant coast, but the ordinary, painful, foundational story of race in America itself. That truth was difficult precisely because it was not exotic at all. But the Melungeons, for all their fame, were never an exception in these mountains. They were only the most visible edge of something far larger, something running quietly beneath the surface of the entire population. Pull back from the 40 families and look at the whole region, and the same threads begin to surface everywhere. The Melungeons were simply where the pattern broke the surface and became visible. Beneath it, the mountains held far more than the legend admitted. Take the African thread first, The story of a pure white Appalachia has no room for black people, and yet they were present from the very beginning, enslaved and free in the valleys and on the farms and deep in the hollows. Their ancestry did not vanish when the records stopped naming them. It settled quietly into families who, generations later, would have sworn they had none. There was a black Appalachia living inside the white one all along, its traces folded into bloodlines that no longer remembered carrying them. The census could be edited. The genome could not. Then the native thread, which the evidence asks us to handle with care. Contact here was real and documented. The border settlers, the long hunters and traders, lived alongside the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, exchanging deer skins and goods across the 18th century, and intermarriage did occur. Some Appalachian families carry a genuine and traceable native inheritance, but the DNA also delivered a quieter correction. The native ancestry is, in most cases, far smaller than family lore insisted. The Cherokee grandmother, that beloved fixture of so many family trees, turns out to be more common in the telling than in the blood. The story was passed down with total confidence. The genome, more often than not, could not confirm her. And here's the part that should give us pause. None of this forgetting was accidental. The one-drop rule and the pioneer stock myth were not opposites. They worked together. One declared that a single drop of African ancestry made a person black and stripped away their rights. The other declared the mountain people pure and white and frozen in time. Between the two, a mixed population was quietly laundered into a uniform one, scrubbed clean on paper, in the family Bible, in the stories told at the dinner table. People did not merely forget their origins, they were given powerful reasons to. But the body keeps a different ledger than the page. You can change a census entry, you can leave a name off a record, soften a family story, choose a more comfortable grandmother to remember. What you cannot do is edit the sequence carried in your cells and passed to your children. The genome is a witness that does not cooperate with the lie it is asked to tell. It held what the documents were rewritten to hide, and it held it across every generation that tried to bury it. Now lay all of these threads on the table at once. The borderland British, the German and the Welsh and the French, the African woven through quietly, the native present in some and imagined in others. Set them side by side, and the legend of one isolated white people does not merely weaken, it collapses into something far larger. Today, the evidence no longer comes from 40 families or a single study. It comes from hundreds of thousands of people. As consumer DNA testing spread across the country, the descendants of the mountains sent in their samples by the thousands, and the pattern that came back was remarkably consistent. A strong British Isles signal, yes, the deepest current in the mix, but never alone. Braided through it, again and again, ran German ancestry, Welsh ancestry, French, African, and native threads, surfacing across vast numbers of people who traced their roots to the same ridges and hollows. Let the point be exact, because precision matters here. The British heritage is not a myth. It is real, and it is deep, and it genuinely shaped the language, the music, and the temperament of the region. The error was never in claiming it. The error was in claiming it was the whole story. The blood was never purely Highland, never purely anything. It was always a weave, and the legend simply cut away every strand but one. So set the two myths down side by side, now that we have undone them both. The mountain people were not transplanted Highlanders frozen in amber. They were borderland exiles, displaced from a violent frontier, mingled with Germans and Welsh and French, with Africans woven quietly through their lines, with a real but smaller native inheritance than the stories claimed. They were not a sealed white enclave preserved by isolation. They were one of the most quietly mixed populations in all of early America, and that forces us to see isolation itself in a new light. For 100 years, we were told the mountains preserved a single pure bloodline, holding it intact against a changing world. The truth is nearly the opposite. The isolation did not preserve purity. It concealed blending. Those remote ridges were not a vault keeping one people unchanged. They were a refuge where many peoples could merge and then quietly forget that they had. This is not a small correction, and it does not stay inside a laboratory. The pioneer stock myth was wielded as a weapon as often as it was worn as a badge, used to romanticize the mountain people and just as easily to dismiss them, and always built on the lie that they were one thing, of one origin. To undo that lie is to change who gets to claim Appalachia, and on what terms. It hands the region back its real inheritance, which is far richer than the counterfeit it was given. For the borderland and the Ulster plantation, for the German and the Welsh and the French, for the African woven silently through the generations and the native truly present in some, the people of these mountains were never who the legend said. They were never one people. They were a people made of everywhere, and that, in the end, is the more remarkable inheritance by far. The science did not invent any of this. It only read a record that had been kept all along. For a century, the mountains were mistaken for a vault, a place that preserved one people unchanged. They were never that. They were an archive of a different kind, holding what the census erased and the family stories quietly rewrote. And what they held was abundance. The descendants who were handed a single flattering legend can now claim the truer one, all of it at once. Borderland and Ulster, German and Welsh and French, African and native, free and unfree. The legend offered purity, and purity was always the lie. What the DNA offers instead is the harder and fuller truth, that the people of these mountains were, from the very beginning, a people made of everywhere. The biology was always there. Now, at last, it can be read.